The following program was funded in part by the Kentucky Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Dave, how do you feel about those stories now?
You know, Debbie, I've never actually seen a ghost. And when you get to an area like this where the stories are so well documented, and you come down into a cave with bats and dripping water, by golly, I can almost feel the presence. As a matter of fact, the person who's looking for a ghost, that might be a pretty good place to start right up there. Do you believe in ghosts? No? Then how would you explain the worldwide prevalence of stories about the supernatural? People in every world culture believe in the return of the dead as spirits, and they tell stories to document these appearances. We'd like to tell you a few tales of the supernatural and let you decide whether or not you believe them.
The stories we're going to tell you were collected from western Kentucky and parts of middle Tennessee. But the supernatural tales told in this region share elements of stories told in many different parts of the world.
All the stories we will tell you come from oral tradition. That is, stories that originated with the folk. Now, a version of a story we tell may be different from what you've heard, but then change is a feature of oral tradition.
Our stories were collected from a variety of sources, some from library archives and some from newspaper accounts based on eyewitness reports. Some were submitted by individuals. It's important for you to understand that the people who originally told these haunting stories believed them to be true.
Our first tale of a haunting is associated with this cave, located near Adams, Tennessee, close to the Kentucky border. It's called the Bell Witch Cave, and it's become the focus of a cycle of supernatural tales that are still told in this area. Owners of the surrounding farm lead visitors through the cavern while relating stories of the strange, unexplained things that have occurred here.
But the experiences they relate are 20th century variations of a very old story.
We don't typically think of our pioneer ancestors as people that believed in ghosts or told tales about them. Instead, we see them as a stalwart, no-nonsense people, busy forging a life out of the wilderness. But these settlers of European heritage most certainly brought with them the beliefs and traditions of their homeland, including a belief in the supernatural. So it shouldn't surprise us to hear of ghosts on the frontiers of early America.
One of the best documented and widely disseminated frontier ghost stories originated right here in Robertson County, Tennessee. The year was 1818, and all this surrounding land was owned by John Bell, an early pioneer of this region who had immigrated with his family from North Carolina. There's little remaining evidence of the settlement that once existed here, but in 1818, this field was the site of a thriving community situated on the American frontier.
The Bells were a prosperous, well-respected family and steadfast members of the Baptist Church. Their home was described as one of the finest residences in Tennessee at that time.
It was in a house very similar to this one that the Bell family haunting began, a haunting that ended only after years of torment from a mysterious being, which to this day is still unexplained. Hundreds of people witnessed the supernatural manifestations. Even Andrew Jackson paid a visit to the Bell house. However, only one written account of the haunting has survived.
In 1846, Richard Bell, John Bell's youngest son, took pen to paper and recounted the troubling events that occurred between May of 1818 and early spring of 1821. The family, however, would not allow his manuscript to be published until all the affected family members were deceased. The story we're about to tell you is taken directly from the accounts of Richard Bell, as they were eventually published in 1894.
Richard Bell explained the 25-year gap between the haunting and his accounting of it by writing. The importance of a diary at that time did not occur to anyone, for we were all subject to the most intense and painful excitement from day to day and week to week, to the end not knowing from whence came the disturber, the object of visitation, what would follow next, how long it would continue, nor the probable result.
The trouble first began with strange knockings on the door, and then loud scratching noises on the outside walls. But these sounds were explained away as the work of a mischievous person. Then the sounds moved inside. First, a gnawing sound like a rat chewing on a bedpost. After a while, this sound was accompanied by a scratching sound like a dog clawing on the floor. Each time these sounds were heard, family members would awake and light candles searching for their source. The sounds would move around the house so all the family was awake. This frightening routine continued for weeks.
To the gnawing and clawing sounds were added the sounds of lip smacking, gulping, and choking noises, sounds of dragging chains, chairs falling over, and stones being dropped on the floor. And then finally, a visible act from the mysterious visitor. Bed clothing began to fall off the children's beds as if being drawn away by someone. The situation was worsening.
Richard Bell wrote, "We had become somewhat used to the mysterious noise and tried to dismiss it from mind, taking every opportunity for a nap. One night, the family had all retired early, and I had just fallen into a sweet doze when I felt my hair beginning to twist, and then a sudden jerk which raised me. It felt like the top of my head had been taken off. Immediately, Joel yelled out in great fright, and next Elizabeth was screaming in her room, and ever after that, something was continually pulling at her hair. No one slept that night."
The spirit took a particular dislike for Elizabeth Bell, tormenting her at every chance. Up until the point of the hair-twisting incident, John Bell had sworn his family to secrecy, but he was at wit's end. He had to seek outside help, and he called upon the assistance of an old friend and fellow churchman, James Johnson. Mr. Johnson was invited to witness the phenomena for himself. He began his visit with Bible reading, singing, and praying. After everyone had retired, the noises commenced as usual. The gnawing and clawing, overturning chairs, knocking on walls, pulling off bed covers. It was as if the ghost were exhibiting every act of its repertoire to show Mr. Johnson what it could do. In frustration, Mr. Johnson shouted, "In the name of the Lord, who are you, or what are you? What do you want? Why are you here?" This calling on the name of the Lord silenced the noises for a while. But shortly they started up again with increased vigor.
Following Mr. Johnson's visit, the persecutions of Elizabeth increased. Her cheeks frequently reddened as if by a hard blow from an open hand, and her hair pulled until she would scream with pain. Well, Mr. Johnson said the whole thing was beyond his comprehension. And Richard Bell wrote, "All of our neighbors were invited and committees formed, experiments tried, and a close watch kept in and out every night. But all of their wits were stifled, the demonstrations all the while increasing in force. And Sister was so severely punished that Father and Mother became alarmed for her safety when alone, and the neighboring girls came almost every night to keep her company."
Not long after the increased attacks on Elizabeth, the ghost took on a startling new dimension. It began to talk, first in a low, distinct whisper, and then gradually gaining strength until it could be heard in every room of the house.
At first, the spirit responded only to questions. but then it began to volunteer information and interrupted family conversations. It became a very opinionated ghost, giving its advice freely, often predicting family fortune and misfortune alike.
Every visitor tried to outwit the spirit and determine its true identity. On one occasion, the family minister thought he'd cleverly trapped the spirit into revealing its identity. It replied, "I cannot lie to you, preacher. I am nobody else and nothing but old Kate Batts, witch, and I've come to torment the life out of old John Bell." And thereafter, the spirit was called and answered to the name of Kate.
Unfortunately for the living Mrs. Batts, a neighbor of the Bells, the story of this incident spread through the community like wildfire. Kate Batts was, according to Richard Bell, eccentric, and this story was all that some folks needed to brand her a witch. Stories spread of how the Bell family troubles were all the result of witch Batts' conjuring, brought on by either a lost love or a bad business deal with John Bell. Even today, the most popular versions of this story center on these themes, and the whole episode is commonly called the Bell Witch Story.
When word got out that the Bells had a talking ghost, visitors increased by large numbers. No one was ever turned away by the Bells, nor charged 1 cent for visiting the ghost. In fact, all who visited were treated hospitably, usually fed, and many were lodged if they'd come a long way, as was the local custom.
The ghost seemed to relish the attention, eagerly entertaining visitors with riddles and rhymes and singing in its sweet, otherworldly voice. Many came to solve the mystery, but none were successful. The spirit boasted of each person it had mystified, all the while keeping up its malicious attacks on Elizabeth and her father.
The ghost didn't confine itself to the Bell household. Kate, as the spirit was commonly called, often harassed unwary merchants passing through the community and frequently visited neighbors.
But the focus of Kate's attacks were against John Bell, or Old Jack as the spirit liked to call him, and his daughter Elizabeth. For 2.5 years, Kate pressed her hatred for this pair, tormenting Elizabeth at every opportunity. But it was against John Bell that the spirit directed its most vicious attacks. Not long after the spirit first revealed itself, Bell began contracting mysterious illnesses, each succeeding illness worse than the last. Finally, John Bell suffered sustained fits of painful muscle contractions. At other times, he would become paralyzed.
These spells would last a day or two and then pass, leaving Bell in robust health, as if nothing had happened the day before.
The afflictions of John Bell worsened, increasing in length until he was immobilized for weeks on end. Whenever he seemed to recover, Kate would directly intensify her attacks. Richard Bell was caring full time for his father by the fall of 1820, and recalls that on one occasion his father felt well enough to attempt a walk outside. Well, Kate must have seen this walk as a defiance of her will, because she soon attacked John Bell in her invisible but powerful form. First, she ripped off his shoes. Then she tore at his clothing and knocked him to the ground several times until he and young Richard retreated to the house, tears streaming down the lined face of the once stalwart John Bell.
Once inside the house, Bell dropped to his knees and prayed for deliverance. His prayers finished, he seemed calm, went to bed, never leaving the house again. On the morning of December the 19th, 1820, John Bell failed to rise at his usual hour. His wife tried to wake him, but found that he was in a deep stupor. John Jr. went immediately for a tonic to revive him, but discovered that all his father's medicines were missing from the cabinet where they were kept. All that remained was a smoky-looking vial, about 1/3 full of a dark-colored liquid.
No one could account for the missing medicine or the mysterious vial. Kate was asked about the vial.
Kate replied, "I put it there, and I gave old Jack a big dose of it last night while he was asleep, which fixed him."
To test Kate's claim, a neighbor caught a cat. John Jr. took a piece of straw and dipped it into the vial, drawing out a drop or two of the dark liquid. He put the straw in the cat's mouth, wiping the liquid on its tongue. The cat jumped, whirled over a few times, stretched out, kicked, and died very quick.
Old Jack lingered in a deep stupor the rest of that day and night, gradually wearing away until on the morning of December the 20th, 1820, he breathed his last breath.
All through the previous day and night, Kate had been around, indulging in wild rantings and singing derisive songs about old Jack, But then John Bell died, and nothing more was heard from her until the day of the Bell burial.
A large crowd gathered with John Bell's family on the sad occasion of his funeral. A solemn and dignified ceremony befit a man of John Bell's status. No less than 3 ministers conducted the services.
All was reverent and calm, up to the moment that John Bell's coffin was lowered into the ground. As the first shovel of dirt was thrown into the grave, Kate broke out in a loud voice singing a rowdy tune and continued singing until the family and friends had all entered the Bell house. The spirit remained with the Bell family throughout the winter and spring of 1821, all the while becoming less active. Finally, it took its leave of the Bell family, bidding Mother Lucy Bell an affectionate farewell and saying she would surely return to see her in 7 years.
And Kate did return in February of 1828, making her appearance much as she had before, first with unexplained noises and then physical demonstrations, especially pulling off bed covers. But this time she didn't speak, and after that 2-week visit, Kate never again bothered the Bell family.
But the story of the Bell Witch spread, gaining international recognition. Many variations of the story were developed in the telling and the retelling, until finally most of the original story was lost. But such is the nature of oral tradition. Each storyteller and each variation helps the tale to evolve, usually retaining the central core of the story while embellishing around the edges to make a good story even better.
The traditional stories told about the Bell Witch are just as good as Richard Bell's account. Ghosts, it seems, are immune to change. Kate certainly has survived the years. Just ask the family who's owned the old Bell farm for the past 30 years. They'll readily tell you of their encounters with Kate.
Cold winds in a summer house, doors slamming and opening in the middle of the night, large unidentified dogs disappearing into the cave or emerging from the cave after the gate had been locked overnight, tourist photographs that contained unexplained apparitional forms,
Blood-curdling screams and singing coming from inside the cave, objects that disappear and then reappear when Kate's name is evoked. And people keep coming to hear about the Bell Witch and perhaps meet Kate in this darkened cave 170 years after her first appearance.
Why did ghosts reveal themselves? The Bell's ghost stated her intent was to drive old Jack to his grave, although no clear motives were ever established. If we're to believe Richard Bell's account, there was no lost love or bad business deal to avenge. Kate was a trickster spirit, to be sure. Most of her actions were entertaining, non-violent, except, of course, the killing of old Jack and the tormenting of his daughter out of her youth.
Yeah, I'd say that goes beyond entertaining. But the popular media of today would like us to think that all ghosts are malevolent, with sinister intentions for all earthly beings. But most traditional supernatural tales do not feature a sinister ghost. Most ghosts go about their business with little fanfare. They have an otherworldly mission to perform.
If that mission can be accomplished without contact with the living, ghosts seem content to remain unseen. Think about that. If that's true, for every ghost that's seen, there must be thousands that go undetected.
And where are most ghosts seen? In most of the stories that we've heard, ghosts can show up just about any place, at any time, day or night. And one of the places most associated with ghosts is a house, a haunted house.
When we think of haunted houses, we think of old, abandoned buildings full of strange noises. But most haunted houses are, or were, occupied. How else would we know they were haunted?
Our next story came to us from Danny Clark of Bowling Green, Kentucky. And it begins back in 1956, at the farmhouse of Danny's grandfather Stinson in Allen County. Danny describes the house as an old two-story log structure that had been weatherboarded over some time before Mr. Stinson had bought the farm. Now, when you entered the front door, you came into a hallway, which led to a kitchen and back that had been added onto the house. The first door on the left in the hall entered into the bedroom of Danny's grandparents. The door on the right led into the living room, where there was also a bed. Directly above the living room was a large upstairs bedroom where 3 beds were kept. The other upstairs room was used for storage. The house was said to have been built in slave times, and according to Danny's grandfather, always had the name for being haunted.
Mr. Stinson was a well-known peddler and merchant who traveled all over Allen County. But in 1956, he became terminally ill and spent the last year of his life bedridden. In 1957, Mr. Stinson passed away, leaving Danny, his mother, and his sister Brenda living in the old house.
One Saturday night, not long after Mr. Stinson died, Danny's grandmother went to visit relatives, leaving Danny, his mother, his sister, and her friend in the house. They went to bed about 10 o'clock. Danny and his mother were in the upstairs bedroom, while Brenda and her friend were to sleep in the living room. The girls, however, did not go to sleep, but stayed up for a while reading and talking. The hour grew late.
All of a sudden, just after midnight, Brenda and her friend heard the faint ringing of a bell. The sound kept getting louder and louder, and Brenda could tell it was coming from her grandfather's old room across the hall. The door that led to the hallway was located beside the bed where the girls were sitting. The door was shut, but there was no way to lock it.
The sound of the bell came right up to the door. Brenda's girlfriend was in a fit of fright. The bell kept ringing and ringing just outside the door for what seemed like the longest time.
Brenda, who had the reputation of being fearless, had soon had enough. She rushed over to the old shotgun leaning in the corner of the room, loaded it, and then slowly approached the door, ready to fire in an instant. Just as Brenda reached the door, the bell suddenly stopped ringing in the hallway, but immediately began ringing outside the living room window. Brenda seized her chance to escape. She grabbed her hysterical girlfriend, dashed out into the hall, and ran up the stairs.
The sound of the bell penetrated the living room window and seemed to float across the room, stopping briefly at the foot of the stairs, where it began to ring even louder. The bell then began moving up the stairs.
The girls were trapped. For some unexplained reason, they couldn't open the door leading to the upstairs bedroom. The door had no lock on it, but it wouldn't budge, although both girls were pushing their weight against it. Just as the sound reached the top of the stairs, the door gave way, and the girls tumbled in, waking Danny and his mother. The sound of the bell stopped.
Danny Clark doesn't recall hearing the bell that night. It had stopped ringing before he'd awakened. His mother, however, heard the bell just as the girls burst into her bedroom, and she allowed the girls to remain upstairs the rest of the night. The next morning, Mrs. Clark went straight for the downstairs bedroom where her father had died. She went to the chest of drawers and opened the bottom drawer. There, in the drawer, among some of her father's old clothing, she found the bell.
You see, when Mr. Stinson was bedridden, one of his sisters brought him a bell to ring whenever he needed anything. For a year, that bell had sounded through the old house, until finally, when Mr. Stinson died, the bell was packed away in a chest of drawers, along with his other things.
The day after the frightening incident, the bell was returned to the sister who had brought it, and the matter was considered closed. But a year or so later, there was a second incident, and this time, Danny heard the ringing, even though the bell had been removed from the house.
The bell ringing wasn't the only strange occurrence that took place in the old house. Later that summer, an even more mysterious incident took place. Another young cousin, Cornelia, was visiting the farm as she oftentimes did. When she was there, she would sleep in the upstairs bedroom. Danny tells us that as long as he can remember, there was a woman's black hat that hung over one of the beds. He supposed it was a Sunday hat.
Cornelia always slept on the bed beneath the black hat, and she recalls that one night she had just dozed off when she felt something tugging at one of her toes. She finally awoke enough to see that there was an old gray-haired woman standing at the foot of her bed. She was staring right at Cornelia, and even though the apparition appeared as a mist or vapor, she could distinguish the form of an old woman, facial features and all.
The old woman moved around the foot of the bed and then right up to the headboard. She took the hat off the wall, placed it on her head, and sat down on the bed, right alongside of Cornelia. After a few minutes, she stood up, placed the hat back on the wall, smiled, and then vanished into thin air. It was years before Cornelia could relate this incident to her family, describing the old woman in great detail. Only then did she learn that the black hat had belonged to her great Aunt Pearl, who had died many years before. David, get your coffee and come on out here on the front porch.
All right. Yeah, it is nice out here, isn't it? Mm-hmm. You know, Debbie, as we were coming into town, I was surprised to see how many great old 19th century houses are still standing here in Russellville.
And they're also well taken care of, too.
Yeah, it almost takes you back to another time, doesn't it? What was it about the old Stinson house that allowed spirits to communicate from the other world? Or was it the house at all? Many believe that certain people are more receptive to these supernatural communications. Perhaps Danny, Brenda, and Cornelia are such people.
Well, what qualifies an incident as supernatural? There are many different types of supernatural tales, and hauntings can take many different forms. The experiences of the Bell family were extraordinary, while the experiences of Danny Clark's family were more typical of a haunting.
Strange noises and forms appearing as vapor or mist are universally described in hundreds of other stories of the supernatural. But one of the most unusual supernatural stories we've heard occurred right here in Russellville, Kentucky.
Back around the turn of the century, still in horse and buggy days, a young woman lived here with her parents. Her father was the town's sexton, caretaker of the cemetery. We would tell you who this young woman actually was, but the family still doesn't like their name associated with the story. So we'll just call her Sarah. Well, Sarah had been seeing a young man of good upbringing for some time. His family was well-to-do, and he was certain to inherit the family business.
All in all, Sarah felt like she had done well in attracting this young man, as did her father and mother. The young couple had been courting for over a year, so, well, it was only natural that their thoughts had turned to marriage. At least, that's the way Sarah and her family saw it.
When it came time for the annual 4th of July church picnic, Sarah felt certain that this would be the occasion that her beau would ask her to marry him. She spent most of that hot summer day preparing for her special moment. She and her mother had made a particularly fine and frilly dress for the occasion, one of those soft white summer dresses with all the lace and pearls. About an hour before her beau was to arrive in his horse and buggy, she sat at her vanity, tying a long pink ribbon into her hair.
Suddenly, a loud, long rumble was heard outside. Startled, Sarah jumped to her feet and ran to see what was happening. Now, the house that Sarah and her family lived in was one of those beautiful old houses with a small square tower built onto the front. Instinctively, Sarah ran to this tower with its higher vantage point. After climbing the small flight of stairs, she stood framed in the arched window, looking to the west.
From that direction, she could see the dark, rolling clouds of a violent summer thunderstorm. She watched as the tops of trees bent over from the increasing velocity of the wind. Within seconds, the storm was overhead, dumping torrential rains, thunder and lightning rumbling and crackling all around. And Sarah's heart sank. She knew there'd be no picnic that afternoon, no marriage proposal. Her frustration got the best of her. She raised a clenched fist to the sky and cursed God for bringing on this terrible weather.
At that instant, a bolt of lightning ripped through the clouds, penetrated the glass of the arched window where the young girl stood, shook every inch of the house, and killed Sarah. Well, knowing that lightning had struck the house, Sarah's parents rushed to find their daughter, first looking in her bedroom and then in every other room of the house.
Finally, they went to the tower window, where they found their daughter's lifeless body lying on the floor, her eyes and her mouth wide open with surprise, her skin white as milk, and her right arm thrust above her head, its hand clenched in a tight fist.
They buried Sarah in her fine summer dress, her engagement dress, and a plot set aside for the sexton's family. Her beau wept throughout the services and never got over his loss. They say he never again courted a young lady and spent out his days as a lonely old bachelor. Well, Sarah's parents, too, suffered through the funeral, laying to rest their only child. And although their grief was immense, after the funeral, they tried their best to get on with their lives.
But this was not to be, for shortly after Sarah's body had been laid in the grave, a strange phenomena began to occur. No one knows who saw it first, but it was there for all to see. It seems that at a certain time of day, not every day, mind you, but you could stand on the west side of the sexton's house, look up to the tower window, and see the ghostly, transparent image of a young woman etched in the glass of the arched window. Her hand thrust above her head, her fist clenched.
Nearly everyone in town at that time saw the girl in the window, and word of the apparition traveled rapidly, and people came from all around to see it. Great crowds would gather on the street waiting for the girl to appear, and they weren't often disappointed. The frequency of the girl's appearances increased with its notoriety, as did the horror of Sarah's family. They just wanted their tragedy to end.
First, they replaced all the glass in the window, only to have the image reappear. They tried replacing the glass several times, but each time the ghostly image returned. They painted over the glass, 3 or more coats of thick paint, but the image bled through and the crowds continued to gather. Finally, Sarah's parents could take it no longer. Her father gave up his job as town sexton, and he and his wife left the house, never to return.
But the girl in the window remained. We're not sure how long the image continued to appear. That information has been lost. But at some point, the window was boarded over and the crowd stopped coming around. The story, however, was not forgotten. And the house still stands at the edge of the cemetery where Sarah is buried.
Well, the window, it's still boarded over. But there's some people here in town that say on summer evenings, just before a thunderstorm, you can still catch a glimpse of the Russellville girl in the window. After all this bad weather we've been having, I'm glad to see the trees budding.
Yeah, I always love to see the dogwood blooming.
The Russellville Girls, an unusual tale of a ghost who returns to haunt her death site through a mysterious image etched in glass. On the other hand, it's not completely unique.
Another story we heard told of a man up in Ohio County who murdered his wife, then threw her body into a very deep sinkhole, only to have her form, her ghost, appear thereafter as a mist rising from that very sinkhole. It was said that her ghost drove her husband insane, and he committed suicide at the edge of the sinkhole. Both ghosts then haunted that site forevermore.
One of the most intriguing stories of a ghost returning in an unusual form happened here in Madisonville, Kentucky in the late 1930s. It was near this old school building in 1915 where our story begins. It was a time of extreme racial segregation. The black citizens lived in parts of town totally separate from the white citizens. But the black community of Madisonville was substantial. They even had their own school at one time, the Atkinson College.
Just on the edge of the campus, in the center of the segregated community, there was a row of houses. Now, many of these houses were rented by coal miners who worked in the nearby mines. Ed Holloman, one of the miners, rented the house nearest the school. He lived there with his wife, Mandy, their 2 children, and an older son of Ed's from a previous marriage. The older son worked in the mines with Ed. Mandy did housework and laundry for some of the school faculty.
By all accounts, the Hollamans were an industrious family, just trying to make ends meet. Mandy especially liked fixing up around the house and the yard. And that summer, she had worked especially hard planting flowers around the house. Earlier that spring, she'd planted a small white oak sapling in the backyard. Always thinking ahead, Mandy figured it would provide good shade during the summers to come. But this was to be Mandy's last summer.
No one knows exactly what happened on that summer day more than 75 years ago, but perhaps the closest explanation of Mandy's demise came from her brother, Albert Taylor, who recounted the story many times after talking to Mandy's family. Albert told of how, on that morning, his brother-in-law, Ed, had eaten a hearty breakfast and left for the mine early. leaving Mandy, the older son, and the 2 younger children at home.
According to Albert, the 2 youngsters had been sent to the spring for drinking water, and their father departed soon after. Mandy's stepson says that he left for work soon after the children were sent to the spring. But the witnesses report that they saw the stepson leaving the house in a hurry, running, and he showed up for work late. The same witnesses say they saw Mandy earlier watering her oak tree in the backyard.
When the children returned from the spring, they found their mother dead from a gunshot wound. They ran to a neighbor, who immediately summoned Ed Holloman and Albert Taylor. Albert was the first to arrive on the scene, even before the police. Albert said that he found Mandy's body lying on the bedroom floor, wrapped in a quilt. Several feet away was a pool of blood, but there was no blood on the quilt, nor was there a bullet hole through it. No gun was ever found.
Albert told how when the police arrived, they found Mandy's body without clothes, and that the bullet had entered on her right side, just under her armpit. There were no serious attempts to explain the mystery surrounding Mandy's death. Just another death in Darktown, hardly worth their concern. The case was soon entered into the records as a self-murder, more or less a legal way of saying suicide.
No explanation was ever given as to how Mandy had gotten wrapped up in a quilt, or how the quilt was without blood stains, and the body found several feet away from the pool of blood. No theory was ever developed as to why a person wanting to commit suicide would choose to, or even could, shoot oneself in the right side just under the armpit, much less getting rid of the gun after committing suicide. And where were the clothes Mandy was wearing earlier that day?
A brief investigation was conducted. The husband was interrogated and the stepson was questioned. But that was about it. The case was closed. Ed Holloman gave up his 2 small children and moved out of Hopkins County. For all intents and purposes, Mandy Holloman was forgotten.
Mandy was forgotten. That is, until 24 years after her mysterious death. That summer, the people of Madisonville began remembering Mandy all over again. You see, that young white oak sapling that Mandy had planted nearly a quarter of a century earlier had grown to maturity. And that summer, on the anniversary of her death, the people of the community began to notice something peculiar about that tree. It had grown into the shape of Mandy's profile. There it was, clear as day for all to see and to photograph.
Had Mandy returned from the dead to remind complacent citizens of her wrongful death? Some say that Mandy was killed near the tree. Their blood spilled on the soil, which was absorbed by the roots, and that's what caused the tree to grow into the shape of her face. Still others say that her blood-stained clothing was buried near the base of the tree, and it was that caused the supernatural transformation. Or did the tree transform itself as a tribute to the woman who nurtured it as a sapling? Whatever caused the phenomena, the people of Madisonville never again forgot Mandy Holloman. She will always be remembered through the story of the Mandy tree.
Debbie, I'm telling you, I think we should have gone straight back there.
No, the man said turn right off the Lower River Road, and that's what I did.
Well, I know he did, but how do you know it's the right road? All these roads down here in this bottom look alike to me.
There's the river, right there.
Are you sure this is the right place?
Sure, there it is, right there on the map.
Okay. You know, tragic death and the return of spirits seems to go hand in hand. But the Mandy Holloman story is very unusual in the tradition of supernatural stories. Oh, we know of stories of plants growing out of the graves, of lovers tragically killed, and of spirits inhabiting trees. But we know of no other story that tells of a tree taking on the facial features of a murder victim.
Most ghosts, it seems, prefer to reveal themselves in a more traditional way. And Western Kentucky has its share of these classic spirits. And one such spirit's associated with this very place, right here on the banks of the Ohio, just downriver from Owensboro.
This once was a very busy spot in Daviess County, cars, trucks, and wagons used to line up along this long, straight country lane, waiting to board Wilson's Ferry, which would carry them to the far shore.
But in the late 1930s, a bridge was built over the Ohio at Owensboro. The state bought out the ferry, and the old ferry landing was abandoned. Well, almost. See, after the ferry quit operating, the landing was a popular spot for young couples to come and watch the moon rise over the river. Well, at least that's what they would say they were doing, parked out on an old lonely road late at night.
On Halloween night, 1946, 2 boys and 2 girls were watching the moon in their car parked at the end of the old ferry road. We can imagine the wind whispering through the dry corn stalks in the nearby field. In the weeds, the crickets chirped their last notes before the first frost. A whippoorwill cried in the distance, and an owl hooted from the top of a tall sycamore tree.
One of the girls said, "Spooky, isn't it?" And at that very moment, the 2 boys saw the apparition at the river's edge. It was long and white, and it danced over the water like no earthly creature. The boy behind the driver's wheel tried to start the car, but the starter whined and whined as the ghost came off the water and up the ferry road. Finally, the engine turned over, and with nowhere to turn around, the boy threw the car into reverse and sped backwards up the road. The ghost glided over the surface of the road, seemingly in pursuit, and then suddenly vanished.
The 4 young people reached the nearest farmhouse. They were all visibly shaken, and one of the boys had to be revived with cold, wet towels. They tried to tell their story, but were so unnerved they didn't make any sense. After a few hours, they headed for home. But the incident was not ignored, and word soon got out about the Wilson Ferry ghost. In fact, the very next night, a group of young people went to investigate.
And they weren't disappointed. After waiting about an hour, the apparition appeared to them. One of the witnesses described it this way: "I looked over my shoulder, and I'm telling you, my hair stood straight up. There was a woman there dressed all in white, like an evening gown, except it had long sleeves and she had a white shawl over her head. Couldn't see her face. She didn't make a sound. I looked away a second and then right back. I don't know how it happened, but all of a sudden she was a white dog that seemed to be moving without legs. It disappeared behind some weeds."
The other 2 witnesses saw only the dog form. One described it as all white, and it glowed like it had phosphorus on it. I couldn't move. The next night, another young person saw the apparition. He said, "It came right up out of the river. It was all in white, and it took about 8 steps, not on the water, but in the air. It walked like an old woman. It never moved its arms. Then it switched into a white dog that floated away a few feet over the surface. I watched until the weeds hit it. Man, was I scared."
Enough was enough. A local constable heard about the stories and decided he'd investigate. But he made the mistake of telling the Owensboro Inquirer of his intentions. Well, the paper ran a story, and that evening 3,000 people showed up at the ferry landing. Well, the ghost didn't show. Ghosts, as we know, don't care for crowds.
But the woman in white did not disappear altogether. After public interest waned, she began to appear again, but only to young people who came to this road to watch the moon. The ghostly vision continued to appear until finally the ferry landing was abandoned altogether as a lover's lane. But speculation only heightened as to who this spirit was.
The explanation most folks have come to accept is based on an incident that occurred here many years ago. Back in the 30s, a young couple had come to a spot not far from here to be alone. As the story goes, the girl's mother disapproved of the boy her daughter was seeing, and she forbade her to see him, forcing her to meet secretly with her boyfriend. She would lie about her activities and often ask her girlfriends to cover for her.
On this particular October night, she told her mother that she'd be at the city library with friends, studying for a test, and would return home by 8 p.m. She was, of course, with her boyfriend. They were parked just a few miles from here. They had been there for hours and had lost complete track of time.
Finally, the boy took out his pocket watch and saw that it was already 9 o'clock. They were both in a panic. The boy started his old car, ground it into gear, and sped along the country lane where they'd parked. To complicate matters, it had started to drizzle, and a dense fog had settled into the river valley.
No one knows exactly how it happened. The couple was anxious, the boy distracted, and he made a grave mistake. Thinking he had turned onto the road leading back to Owensboro, he instead turned onto the road leading to the ferry landing. In the dark, the rain, and the fog, he lost a sense of direction and could see no landmarks.
Many of the roads here in this broad bottomland are straight, narrow, and built up on levees. There was no reason to think he was anywhere but on the road back to town. Fog or no fog, he had to get his girlfriend home, and soon. He accelerated, knowing that the road was as straight as an arrow. The couple was silent. Only the sound of the old Ford engine could be heard just above the crunch of the tires on the gravel road.
The car, moving at a high speed, became airborne as it hit the ferry ramp. For a second, it seemed to pause in midair. Then it plunged into the river. The boy's door sprung open, and he instinctively swam to the shore only a few yards away. The girl never escaped the car and drowned. Her body was discovered the next day, still in the car, when it was hauled from the river. You see, the car was in only about 5 feet of water, its rear end clearly visible above the surface of the river.
The girl's mother was stricken with grief and guilt. If only she hadn't forbidden her daughter to see the boy, maybe they would have courted as other young couples in their homes. There would have been no reason for them to have been out on that dark country road that night. The girl's mother sank into a deep depression, took ill, and died within a year of the accident.
Many people believe that the woman in white who appeared at Wilson's Ferry was the spirit of the young girl's mother, who had returned to warn other young couples of the dangers of deception and of dark country roads. Until her mission was complete, she, like the spirit of Hamlet's father, was doomed for a certain term to walk the night.
Our final story is set against the backdrop of one of the oldest sporting traditions in America, a sport avidly practiced by our first president, George Washington. The sport is fox hunting.
Not the kind of fox hunting that might first come to mind. Not riding to the Hounds, where ladies and gentlemen of wealth pursued the fox cross-country on the backs of well-bred horses. No, about all our hunters here share with that kind of fox hunting are the Hounds.
The kind of fox hunting we're talking about usually doesn't start until after dark. The object is to find yourself a good place to let your hounds loose, build a campfire, and then sit back and listen to your dogs call out as they pursue the sly fox. No one wants to see the fox caught. It's better to leave the critter out there for another night's hunt.
Although the sport has changed somewhat over the years, there are still those who prefer the old way of hunting, like the men we're out with tonight. They're all members of the Lincoln Fox Hunting Club, located right here in Hart County, Kentucky. Our story also originated in Hart County and came to us from Mrs. Geraldine Norman of Louisville, whose family hails from this rugged ridge country.
This is how Mrs. Norman told us the story. Back in the 30s and 40s, there was a man named John Bishop who owned a small farm along the base of Fisher Ridge in the southeast corner of the county. It was said that he was a big man and that he ruled his family with a strong hand. He claimed not to believe in anything, neither heaven nor hell.
The one thing Bishop did believe in was fox hunting, and his prized possessions were a pair of excellent foxhounds. Now, for the most part, Bishop kept to himself, but if a neighbor wanted a fox hunt, well, then old John was more than sociable. Many of his neighbors brought their young hounds along to train with Bishop's famous dogs, and people came from far and near trying to buy his hounds, but he wouldn't sell them for any price.
When Bishop wasn't hanging with neighbors, he hunted with his sons, who were in their teens by the time this story unfolded. Most nights the hunt went as planned, but on other nights a strange thing started happening. When the men reached a certain spot on top of Fisher Ridge, a light appeared in front of them. It moved very slowly, floating about 6 feet up in the air, and then it would stop every few feet, as if wanting the hunters to follow it.
When the light appeared, the hounds came back whining and cowered at the men's feet. No amount of coaxing could get them away from the side of their master. Whenever that light appeared, the men knew that the fox hunt was over.
This always angered Bishop, and many times he wanted to follow the light, but his sons would raise such a fuss that he'd always give in and go on back to the house with them. The troubling thing was that the light always appeared just when Bishop knew a fox could be stirred up.
One damp Sunday night, all of Bishop's boys were away from home, and no neighbors had come around to go hunting. But this didn't stop old John. He put on his boots, grabbed his coat, and called to his wife that he was taking the hounds out for a while. His wife caught a glimpse of him leaving through the back door. She got up, went to the kitchen window, and she could see him out back, hooking leads up to his hounds by lantern light.
The wind picked up and a cold rain started to fall. She was certain he wouldn't be out long. But then again, he was a determined, even obsessed man when it came to fox hunting. She watched her husband and his prize hounds as they walked toward Fisher Ridge. Thinking he might be hungry when he returned, she set about baking some fresh biscuits.
The hours ticked by, and Bishop did not return. Midnight approached, and he still wasn't home. Mrs. Bishop was concerned. Not worried, mind you, but concerned. The bad weather would have brought an average fox hunter home by now, but her husband wasn't average when it came to the hunt. So she covered the biscuits, put a pot of coffee on to boil, and went to bed.
About 3 in the morning, Mrs. Bishop heard the back door slam shut and a noise that sounded like somebody stumbling around in her kitchen. She distinctly heard a chair fall over and the coffee pot bounce off the floor. A dish shattered. Mrs. Bishop wrapped her blanket around her shoulders and rushed to see what was the matter. There, standing in the middle of her kitchen, was her husband. He seemed in a daze. He was staring off into the dim light, not really focusing on anything, just staring. When Mrs. Bishop spoke to him, he wouldn't or couldn't answer. In the corner of the kitchen, the two hounds lay shivering and whimpering.
Mrs. Bishop got her husband undressed and into bed and managed to spoon some coffee into his mouth. For 3 days, he lay in his bed, never ate, never spoke a word to anyone. He just laid there with the quilt over his head, day and night. His hounds lay under the bed, never moving or making a sound. They were so far back under the bed that Mrs. Bishop could see only the yellow glow of their eyes.
On the 4th day, Bishop got out of bed, dressed, went outside and hitched the horses to the wagon. He loaded up his prize hounds and drove to Horse Cave, where he sold the dogs to a man who'd been after them for a long time. Never again did John Bishop go fox hunting. Never again did he allow his sons to go hunting up on Fisher Ridge. Some say the dogs never hunted again either. They lost the instinct. They lost the heart to trail the sly fox.
We'll never know what John Bishop saw up on the ridge that night, but other hunters in other parts of the world have had similar, frightening experiences. Stories abound in many European cultures that tell of wild hunts, of ghostly hunters and hounds with fiery eyes that crisscross the night sky, or speed through dark forest hovering just above the ground. These apparitions often beckon hunters to follow them, and if he does, it means certain death.
Did John Bishop see the wild hunt? If so, did he almost decide to join the ghostly hunters? Whatever he saw, it changed his life forever. There weren't any known sightings of the light after Bishop's experience, but after word of the incident got around, not many people went hunting up on Fisher Ridge. So, David, what did you think about fox hunting?
Well, I tell you, I was pleasantly surprised. After the week we'd had, I was afraid I was going to have to hike up and down those ridges out there. Thank you, Mr. Chadwick. Yeah. No, I love a sport where you stand around a campfire and just listen to your dogs around.
I like the idea that no one gets killed.
Yeah, you got that right.
You know, Mr. Chadwick said this place has been here since 1928.
Yeah.
That date ring any bells?
Well, it's about the same time that Mr. Bishop was on that fox hunt, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. You know, this old place kind of reminds me of a lot that we've found this week. You know, things change all around, but certain things don't.
You know, that's a lot like our stories.
Mm-hmm.
They change and they evolve and things are added or taken away, but the central core of the story never changes. It's the same story.
Now, you know, the other thing that I found a lot of fun this week was kind of the follow-ups on a couple of these stories. What was that, Cornelia called?
Yeah, Cornelia, Danny Clark's cousin. I hadn't talked to her in years.
Right.
And Danny had told us the story and had no idea where she even was now. And
no sooner that he talked to us that Cornelia calls him just calls him out of the blue. Said she just had the idea that we needed to talk to her.
Isn't that something? Well, that's like there. We got a Mandy tree in Madisonville. That story that Mr. Cole was telling us that when he bought the house, he remodeled it. And the original 2 rooms, it wasn't a 2-room house. There was a double fireplace, fireplace that heated both rooms, and he tore that out. When he tore it out, he found a .22 caliber rifle stuck up in the chimney, right above, into the hearth part. And, if you remember the story, there was no gun ever found, right?
Found
Hey.
Let me throw your original question back to you.
All right.
How do you feel now?
Well, I'm not saying.
Do you believe in ghosts?
If I were a betting man, I'd put it about 9 to 5 that they really do exist out there. What about you? Do you believe in ghosts?
'Twas late, so late, all in the night, when they were fast asleep. Little Margaret appeared all dressed in white, standing at their bed feet. Oh, how do you like that snow white pillow? How do you like your sheet? How do you like that fair young girl that lies in your arms asleep? Oh, well, do I like my snow white pillow? Well, do I like my sheet? Much better do I like the fair young girl that stands at my bed feet. He called on a serving man to go and saddle the dapple roan. He went to her father's house that night. He knocked on the door alone. Is little Margaret in her room, or is she in the hall? Little Margaret is in her coal-black coffin, with her face turned to the wall. Unfold, unfold those snow-white robes, be they ever so fine, and let me kiss them clay corpy lips, for I know they'll never kiss mine. Once he kissed her little white hand, and twice he kissed her cheek. 3 times he kissed her clay corpy lips, and he fell in her arms asleep.